There's three things the text tells us about the presence of God. First, his presence is an inescapable fact. In verses 1 to 6, show how God surrounds us. His knowledge surrounds us. And it says that God knows us whether we're sleeping or active, whether we're home or traveling. The second part of verse 2 and 3 talk about he perceives my thoughts. He's familiar with all my ways, which is my behavior. So he knows everything on the inside and knows everything on the outside. See, when you and I look at things, we can see the outside, but it's very hard to discern the thoughts. Or we can see people when they're near, but it's very hard to tell what they're doing when they're far away. But not God. He's all-knowing. He's omniscient. And then in verse 4 it says, before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. And here's where the attributes of God intersect and link. If you want to understand how God relates to time, you could imagine time as a river with a lot of bends in it. And there's boats on the river, and the boats can't see each other because this boat's in the present, this boat's in your past, this boat's in the future. They're different places in time. But imagine that there's a mountaintop, and then whoever's on the top of the mountain can see the whole river, so that all the boats are present to the person at the top of the mountain. That's how God relates to time. That when God looks at time, he sees all of it at once. And you and I have a tendency to fall into the mistake of saying, well, God can foresee the future. That's talking as if he's trapped in the present with you, but he's not. All moments are present to God. All moments are equally related to God. He sees it all happening at once. And what that means is only he knows who you are, because he sees your past, present, and future. He sees everything. You can only ever see a little slice of yourself. God sees everything, but you only ever see a little slice. You see yourself as young. You see yourself as old. You see yourself as whatever, but he sees all of you, and therefore only God knows who you are. And so we're surrounded by God's knowledge. Verses 7 to 12 talks about how we're surrounded by his presence. It says, if I go to the heavens, or if I make my bed in the depths, if I go all the way down to the depths of the earth, you're there. And then he says, if I go to the wings of the dawn, that's utter east, where the sun's coming up, or if I go on the far side of the sea, if I go as far east as I can possibly go, as far west, you're there, you're everywhere. Then it says, where can I flee from your presence? Now, this is the word for face. The Hebrew, whenever you see the word in the Old Testament, the word presence, it's actually the Hebrew word for face, God's face. And what this is saying is everywhere he goes, there's God's face. God is repletively present. He's completely present at every point in space. So not only God is present to every point in time, but God is present in every point in space. So first of all, we're surrounded by his knowledge. Secondly, we're surrounded by his presence. And then thirdly, we're surrounded by his power. You created my inner being. That's my soul. And you knit me together in my mother's womb. That's my body. So it's saying both your body and your soul are created by God, upheld by God. But then it says, and all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. All the days ordained for me. All of your days are ordained. He not only creates, ordains, sustains, and upholds your body and soul, keeping you together at every second, but he also creates, sustains, ordains, and sustains your history. Are you figuring out what he's saying here? Because at the one end of human life is conception. He says, in my mother's womb, you knew me. You were knitting me together. But at the other end, what about the other end? All my days, at the very end of your life, when you're old and you feel like, what am I even here for? It's ordained. Every single day that you're on earth is ordained. There's a plan. There's a reason. Now, here's what he's saying. From conception to the last breath, God is in charge. He created you. He ordained. He sustains. He upholds. See, his power overshadows absolutely every second of your life. Here's one of the implications of the presence of God. From the early Christians to the ancient Jews have always said both abortion and active euthanasia are wrong because you're putting yourself in the place of God. God's in charge of those parts of life. Life in the very, very beginning in the womb and life at the very, very end when you're really old. That life is fragile. And we might say, let's do something about it. But that's a violation, according to the Bible, of the glory and rights of God. And therefore, you are sitting in the throne of God if you do something about life in the womb. John the Baptist and Jeremiah were called by God and filled with the Spirit in the mother's womb. When you're in the mother's womb, you're the image of God. But at the other end, when you feel absolutely useless and you feel like, what am I even here for? Why not end it all? That's not your place. All your days are ordained. You're still under the shadow of God and his presence and his power. Now, point 2. The presence of God is not just an inescapable fact, but for the human heart, it's a radical threat. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. Now, in English, it comes across as a kind of a positive, but it's not. Literally, it says, too wonderful from me is this knowledge. It's a man who is saying, This is too much for me. This is beyond me. I don't get it. This is too amazing. You hem me in. This all-present God, this all-powerful God, this all-knowing God. When you start to realize that, it starts to feel like a blanket you're smothering under. You're suffocating underneath it. And that's what he begins to do. And then very quickly, he slides from 5 and 6, which is, I'm kind of threatened by this, and I feel like you're hemming me in. I feel smothered, to verse 7, when it says, where can I go from your spirit, and where can I flee from your presence? Where can I flee from your presence? It's rebellion. It's the same two Hebrew words that describe what Jonah did in the very beginning of the book of Jonah. Where can I flee from your presence, from your face? How can I get away from your face? And so David's moved from being kind of like just sort of suffocating from the idea of God everywhere to just saying, let me away, let me get away, let me out of here. Modern people have taken a perfectly great idea, and that is democratic political self-determination, and we have elevated it to an ultimate spiritual reality and the very meaning of life. We feel like I have to be me, I have to live my way, I have to live as I decide is right or wrong, and if I don't have the freedom to live as I want to live, my life is meaningless. That's how we are. That's what our culture tells us. And if that's your understanding of life, and it is our understanding of life here, the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present God is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. It just destroys that very idea. And that's the reason why David, that's the reason why Jonah, and that's the reason why so many of us we want to escape this all ever-present God. We don't want to be around. We don't want to believe he exists. I don't want to live for God. I will not live for God. I want to live for me. I want to live for myself. Let me out of here. Where can I go? Why? Because then I can't be what I want to be. I want to live free. If the meaning of life is to live any way you want, then if there is a God like this, you can't live that way. And how do we get away? But the way we try to get away, we don't believe in him, or we don't believe he's a God like that. David goes from being really upset, feeling hemmed in and smothered, to outright, let me out of here, and then he changes again. And he experiences the ambivalence about trying to escape from God. Your hand will guide me, and your right hand will hold me fast. Do you see that change in tone? He says, I want to be free, I want to be free. And yet, if you're there, and everywhere I go, your right hand guides me, your hand guides me, and your right hand holds me fast. A hand that guides so that you don't get lost. A hand that holds you so that you don't fall down. In other words, man is freedom. That is what I mean when I say we are condemned to be free. He's saying, if you want to be free, no hand to hold you, no hand to guide you, nothing inside yourself or outside of yourself to rely on. We want to be free, but if we are free, we have to realize no hand, no guidance, no moral values. So you see, the presence of God is an inescapable fact, and yet it's also a radical threat. And this is our condition. The human condition is we can't live with God, we can't live without God. But the psalm goes on. Point 3, David eventually breaks through to seeing the presence of God as an absolute transforming joy. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light will become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Now, in the Psalms, what is darkness? It's always suffering, danger, the possibility of death, terrible disease. Darkness are times of absolute terror. And when you plunge into the dark, you feel like, I'm lost. But no. What if you have a God that you can't get rid of? What if you have a God that is always there? What if you have a God who's absolutely present, who's got you by the hand? Instead of that being a threat, wait a minute, that's wonderful. Because God can't lose me in the darkness. For God, darkness is as light, and therefore I'm safe. He's got me by the hand, and even my darkness will turn to light. And how precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is some of them. Precious. It's a word that usually has to do with diamonds and jewels and gold. And he's saying, now, the idea of your knowledge, the idea of your presence is rich to me. At the very end of this journey, as he's getting more and more excited about the presence of God, he's breaking through and seeing it as more and more transforming joy. Finally, he says, when I awake, verse 18, I am still with you, and I, in righteousness, will see your face. When I awake from death, I will be satisfied with seeing your form. David has moved away, so far away from being threatened by this God who's always around me. He says, I've got a God who is so impossible to lose, who is always present with me, who's got me by the hand and will never let me go. He's gripped me so strongly that even if I die, he's going to be with me. He's going to be with me through death, and he's going to wake me up. And in my resurrected body, I will see him. You know what David's saying? If God's got you by the hand, even if you go into darkness, it'll become light. And even if you go into death, it'll become resurrection. Death death, the most implacable, inexorable foe of the human race, he reaches right down through that and with a tug of his hand pulls her right up through it, almost to say, if I have you by the hand, even death is just a nice night's sleep. We all struggle with this idea of a God who's all around me. We find it smothering. We want to make our own decisions. We don't like being observed. We don't like to feel like we're totally accountable for everything. And at the same time, we want him. We want that hand. We want to trust him. We want to rest in him. We want these assurances. How did David do it? The answer is in that last section. The secret to the whole psalm is there. After all this time of wanting to get away, not wanting God to look in, feeling hemmed in, right? At the very end, he invites absolute scrutiny, asks God to come all the way in. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offense in me, any sin at all, and then lead me in the path everlasting. One of the reasons we want to be away from the presence of God is not right, because we want to be free. And of course, we know that God's service is perfect freedom. But one of the reasons why we're afraid of the presence of God is warranted. He's holy, and we're not. The fact that we want to live our own lives, even though he's created us, he has ordained us, he has sustained us, he keeps us alive every second. We want to live our own lives the way we want to live our own lives. That's sin. We have no right to our lives, and yet we do it. We take it. That's sin. And God is holy, and we're sinful. And if we actually were to get in the real presence of the face of God, we couldn't survive. David knew that God said to Moses, you won't survive my presence. You know what Revelation 6:16 says? If you were to actually see God face to face in your sin, you would say to the mountains, fall on me, and to the hills, cover me, and hide me from the face of the one who sits on the throne. If you actually saw God face to face, you would know, I need to be covered. I can't stand this. He sees me. He knows me. I know myself. I can't stand myself. That's what would happen. So how does David get that kind of assurance that the presence of God will not be a lethal heat, but will be cool, wonderful love? David's greater son, who died on a cross praying for his enemies, happened. And that is the answer to the riddles. That's how David can have this assurance, though he doesn't probably understand why, that the presence of God is not going to destroy him. Jesus Christ died praying Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? If you read the rest of Psalm 22, you know what it's all about? It's about distance. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why are you so far from the words of my groaning? Do not be so far from me. O Lord, be not afar off. The whole song is about a God who's far away. Here's David, and he can't lose the presence of God. He can't get far away from God. And here's David's greater son, Jesus Christ, and he can't find the presence of God. You know why? David knew that because God had him by the hand, even darkness would turn to light. But Jesus knew, because God had let go of his hand, that even the midday light was turning to darkness, and it was. He was plunged into darkness. David was knit together in his mother's womb. Jesus was torn apart on the cross. Why did Jesus get the absence of God? Why did Jesus get torn away from God? Why did Jesus lose the Father's hand? He was getting what we deserve. See, we try to get away. We try to live our own lives. We try to escape the inescapable, and that's wrong. And what's the penalty? To get what we ask for, to be abandoned. And Jesus was abandoned. He lost the presence of God so that if you believe in Jesus, you have the presence of God forever. And he's got you by the hand, and he'll never let you go. Never. The doctrine of the presence of God, once you understand the gospel of Jesus Christ, becomes a transforming, though edgy, comfort. What do I mean by edgy? Well, there's still an edge to it, isn't there? He's always with you. He sees what you're doing. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't say that. You should live consistently because he's there. There's an edge. But in the end, it's an infallible comfort, because it doesn't matter how dark things are. It doesn't matter what you're going through. He's got you by the hand. And if some of you say, but everything's going wrong lately, well, maybe that's him actually making sure that you come back to him. He's pursuing you. He's not abandoning you. In Jesus Christ, he will never let you go. He's got you by the hand. There is no refuge from him. There's only refuge in him.